Xavier Bennett leaned back in his office chair, staring at the report in front of him. Customer complaints had been piling up about one of his 6 diners' rude staff, slow service, and a general decline in quality. He had bought this chain 5 years ago, turning it around from near bankruptcy, but now it seemed like things were slipping again. His district manager, Paul, had assured him it was just a rough patch, but Xavier wasn't convinced. He had built this company by being hands-on, and he wasn't about to let it fall apart because of bad management. There was only one way to get the truth. He had to see it himself. By the next morning, Xavier had transformed. His usual sharp suit was replaced with faded jeans and a hoodie. A fake beard and glasses disguised his face, and since he had never personally met the employees at this location, there was no risk of being recognized. This was a corporate chain. After all, most of the staff only knew him as a name on a memo. As he stepped inside the diner, the atmosphere immediately felt off. The place wasn't packed, but there were enough customers to keep the staff busy. Yet a group of employees stood near the register, chatting among themselves instead of helping people. A young waitress, no older than 20, rushed between tables, clearly overwhelmed. She was the only one actually working. Xavier stepped up to the counter. A man in his 40s, wearing a manager's name tag that read Rick, barely glanced at him. "You ordering or not?" Rick muttered, tapping at his phone. Xavier cleared his throat. "Yeah, I'll take a coffee and a breakfast platter." Rick didn't even respond. He just turned and yelled toward the kitchen, "Order up," before going back to his phone. Xavier took a seat at the counter, watching. The young waitress, whose name tag read Grace, was doing everything, taking orders, refilling drinks, and even running food when the kitchen staff was slow. The other employees, 2 waiters and a busboy, were doing the bare minimum, occasionally tossing rude comments at her. "Hey, Grace, you trying to get a raise or something?" One of them, a guy named Jared, snorted. "Yeah," another, a blonde waitress named Megan, added. "You're making us look bad." Grace ignored them, forcing a polite smile as she handed a plate to an elderly man sitting alone at a booth. Xavier kept his eyes on her. Something about her was different. She wasn't just working hard. She actually cared. Then something caught his attention. The elderly man reached into his pocket, his hands trembling. He pulled out a few crumpled bills, his expression falling when he realized he didn't have enough. Grace saw it too. Without hesitation, she pulled out her own wallet, quickly slipping a few bills into the register when no one was looking. "You're all set, sir," she said with a warm smile. The old man blinked, looking down at his plate, then back at her. I didn't. It's on the house today," she said softly. Xavier felt something tighten in his chest. She hadn't done it for attention. She hadn't even hesitated. And yet, no one else had noticed. The other employees were too busy slacking off, and Rick was still glued to his phone. Xavier clenched his jaw. This place had problems, but Grace wasn't one of them. And now, he was determined to find out just how deep the issues ran. Xavier stirred his coffee, letting the bitter taste settle on his tongue as he observed the scene unfolding around him. The tension in the diner was unspoken, but it was there a quiet divide between those who cared and those who didn't. Grace was holding this place together, and no one seemed to appreciate it. A loud clatter came from the kitchen. A cook, his apron stained with grease, shoved a plate onto the counter. The eggs were overcooked, the toast nearly burnt. Xavier glanced down at his own plate, realizing it wasn't just his order. Every dish coming out looked rushed, like no one in the kitchen cared. Grace rushed over, taking the plate meant for another table. She hesitated, biting her lip. Then, with a deep breath, she carried it over to a middle-aged couple. The woman frowned at her plate. "This is cold." Grace's expression didn't falter. "I'm so sorry about that." "Let me fix it for you." Before she could take the plate back, Rick finally looked up from his phone. "No refunds, no remakes," he said. The woman's eyebrows furrowed. "Excuse me." Rick didn't even bother looking at her. "You ordered it, you got it." "That's how it works." Grace's face tensed slightly, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'll talk to the kitchen and see." "You won't do anything," Rick interrupted. We're not running a charity." Xavier set his cup down, his patience wearing thin. The way Rick spoke, the way he dismissed customers and employees alike was a problem, and from the way no one reacted, it was clear this was normal. The woman scoffed, shaking her head. "We've been coming here for years. This place used to be different." Rick shrugged. "Then go somewhere else." Xavier watched as Grace's fingers tightened around the edge of her tray. She looked at the woman, then back at Rick, clearly weighing her options. Finally, she turned on her heel and disappeared into the kitchen. A minute later, she returned with a fresh plate, setting it in front of the woman with a quiet, "Here you go." Rick's eyes narrowed. "What did I just say?" Grace didn't flinch. "I made it myself." Rick let out a sharp breath, shaking his head in irritation. "You're lucky I don't dock your pay for that." Xavier felt his grip tighten around his cup. That was it. He had seen enough. He stood, carrying his plate to the counter and placed it in front of Rick. "You eat this." Rick blinked, finally giving Xavier his full attention. "What? You eat this plate of food?" Xavier repeated, his voice calm. "Because if you're fine serving it to paying customers, then it should be good enough for you." Rick scoffed. "Who do you think you are?" Xavier pulled off his glasses, then reached up, peeling away the fake beard. The moment his face was fully visible, the color drained from Rick's face. Grace's eyes widened. The other employees who had been lounging around, ignoring the chaos, suddenly straightened. Xavier let the silence hang for a moment before speaking again. "I own this diner." Rick's mouth opened and closed, his previous arrogance evaporating in an instant. Xavier turned to Grace. "Go take a break." She hesitated. But that wasn't a suggestion. With one last careful glance at Rick, she nodded and stepped away. Xavier turned back to the manager. "Walk with me." Rick followed, his steps less confident now. Xavier led him to the small break room in the back, closing the door behind them. "You've been running this location for how long?" Xavier asked. Rick swallowed. 3 years. "And in those 3 years, when did you decide that customers didn't matter?" Rick's hands fidgeted at his sides. "Look, we're understaffed, the kitchen's slow, I can't fix everything." Xavier nodded slowly. "You're right, you can't fix everything. But you can control how you treat people. You can control whether or not you care." Rick opened his mouth, but Xavier held up a hand. "I've been watching you since I walked in. Employees slacking off, food coming out cold, customers being treated like an inconvenience. That's not a staffing issue, that's a leadership issue." Rick exhaled sharply. "So what now, you gonna fire me?" Xavier studied him for a long moment. "No, not yet." Rick blinked, caught off guard. "I don't fire people without giving them a chance to fix their mistakes," Xavier said. "But make no mistake, you're on thin ice. Things are changing starting now." Rick nodded stiffly, though his jaw was tight. Xavier didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the break room, his mind already forming the next steps. Grace was standing near the entrance, clearly unsure if she should be back on the floor. Xavier approached her. "Come with me." She followed him outside, the cool air hitting them as they stepped onto the sidewalk. He crossed his arms, studying her. "Why are you still working here?" She blinked at him. I need the job." "You could work anywhere, and yet you're here, covering for a manager who doesn't appreciate you and coworkers who don't pull their weight." Grace let out a small, tired laugh. "Someone has to care." Xavier nodded, his respect for her deepening. "You paid for that man's meal." Her face flushed slightly. You didn't have to, no one was watching. No one was going to fire you if you didn't, but you did it anyway." She hesitated before answering. "He comes in every week, he always orders the same thing, and sometimes he doesn't have enough." Xavier felt something settle in his chest. "You remind me of why I started this business in the first place." She looked at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "I bought this diner chain because I believe in places like this, places where people feel welcome, where food isn't just food, it's comfort, it's community." Grace exhaled, a small smile forming. "I think it can be that again." Xavier nodded. "It will be." And with that, the real work began. Xavier re-entered the diner, his mind already racing with the next steps. He had seen enough to know that this location was failing not because of external pressures, but because of the people running it. That was something he could fix. Rick was back at the register, his posture stiff. His earlier arrogance had faded, but Xavier wasn't convinced the lesson had sunk in yet. The other employees were still hanging around, cautiously watching Xavier. They knew something big was happening, but none of them seemed eager to step up or take responsibility. Grace had returned to the floor, moving with the same quiet efficiency she had before. If the tension in the air affected her, she didn't show it. Xavier approached the counter, standing right across from Rick. "Call everyone in," Xavier said. "Now?" Rick hesitated for half a second before turning and motioning for the employees to gather. They shuffled over, some looking uneasy, others indifferent. Jared crossed his arms. "Are we in trouble?" Xavier let the silence settle before responding. "Depends." "Do you think you should be?" Jared glanced at Megan, but she didn't answer. Xavier folded his arms. "I came in here today expecting problems. I didn't expect to see a single employee holding this place together while the rest of you stood around doing nothing." Megan shifted uncomfortably. "We do our jobs." Xavier locked eyes with her. "Do you?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. Xavier turned his attention to Rick. "And you let it happen. You let bad habits spread. You let laziness slide. And when customers had an issue, you dismissed them like they didn't matter." Rick's jaw tightened. Xavier continued. "This isn't a failing store because of bad location, bad luck, or bad customers. This is a failing store because the people running it stopped caring." No one spoke. Xavier exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Things change starting today. If you don't want to work, don't come back tomorrow. If you don't care about customers, don't come back tomorrow. If you think this place is just a paycheck and nothing more, don't come back tomorrow." Jared scoffed. "You can't just fire everyone." Xavier raised an eyebrow. "Watch me." Jared's confidence faltered. Xavier turned to Grace. "You've worked here the longest, haven't you?" She nodded hesitantly. "How often do you cover for other people?" Grace hesitated. "A lot." Xavier looked at the others. "Anyone else willing to admit that?" Silence. Xavier nodded. "That's what I thought." He turned back to Grace. "You're getting a raise, effective immediately." Her eyes widened. What?" "You heard me." Xavier's tone left no room for argument. He glanced at Rick. "And you're on probation. You've got one chance to prove you can turn this around. If I walk in here again and see the same mess I saw today, you're done." Rick's lips pressed into a thin line, but he gave a stiff nod. Xavier turned back to the rest of the employees. "If you stay, you're going to start acting like a team. That means actually working. That means respecting customers. That means carrying your weight. If that's a problem, there's the door." No one moved. Xavier nodded. "Good. Now let's get back to work." The employees dispersed, their energy noticeably different. Jared and Megan looked shaken, but whether they'd actually change remained to be seen. Rick kept his head down, clearly processing everything. Grace lingered for a moment before approaching Xavier. "Thank you." Xavier shook his head. "No, thank you. You're the reason this place is still standing." She smiled a little. "I just do my job." Xavier looked around the diner, taking in the worn-down atmosphere. "Not anymore. You're going to do more than that. You're going to help rebuild this place." Her eyes widened slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean I need someone here who actually cares. Someone who can help turn this place back into what it's supposed to be." Grace hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." Xavier glanced at the kitchen, where food was still coming out unevenly. There was still a lot of work to do, but for the first time since stepping through the doors, he felt something shift. This wasn't just about fixing a failing location. This was about making sure it would never fall apart again. Xavier remained at the diner for the rest of the day, watching closely as the changes began to take effect. The employees, shaken by his unexpected presence and the ultimatum he had given, moved with a new sense of urgency. Even Jared and Megan, who had been the worst offenders in slacking off, were at least making an attempt to contribute. Rick, though still visibly tense, was paying more attention to the customers instead of his phone. Despite the improvement, Xavier knew one day wouldn't fix everything. The habits that had formed here were deeply ingrained, and it would take more than a single confrontation to ensure lasting change. As the dinner rush began, the kitchen struggled to keep up. Orders piled up, and Xavier noticed the cooks cutting corners, rushing plates out before they were properly checked, letting food sit too long under the heat lamps. He stepped into the kitchen, immediately spotting the issue. The head cook, a burly man named Dennis, was moving at his own pace, clearly used to working without oversight. Xavier approached him, watching as Dennis slid another plate onto the counter without a second glance at it. The scrambled eggs were unevenly cooked, the bacon nearly burnt. "Would you serve this to your own family?" Xavier asked. Dennis glanced up, startled. "What?" Xavier gestured to the plate. "If your mother came in here and ordered breakfast, would you put this in front of her?" Dennis looked at the food, then back at Xavier. "We're busy. We don't have time for perfection." Xavier shook his head. "It's not about perfection, it's about care. If we don't care, why should anyone come back?" Dennis exhaled sharply, grabbing the plate and scraping it onto a fresh one. "Fine. But we need more hands back here if you want everything perfect." Xavier nodded. "Then we'll get more hands, but the standard starts changing now." Dennis didn't argue further, but Xavier could see the shift in his demeanor. He was listening. That was the first step. Back on the floor, Grace continued working tirelessly, handling both customers and her coworkers with a level of patience that Xavier found admirable. When a young mother struggled to calm her crying toddler, Grace knelt beside the table, offering the child a small stack of napkins to play with. It was a small gesture, but it worked. The toddler quieted, allowing the mother a moment of relief. Xavier approached her as she returned to the counter. "You ever thought about management?" Grace blinked at him. "Me. You're already doing half of what a good manager does. You keep things running, you handle customers better than anyone here, and you actually care." She hesitated, the idea clearly catching her off guard. "I don't know if I'm ready for that." Xavier leaned against the counter. "You weren't ready to pay for that man's meal today either, but you did it anyway. Sometimes, the best leaders are the ones who don't go looking for the role, they just step up when no one else will." Grace glanced around the diner, taking in the changes. The atmosphere was still tense, but there was a difference, a shift in energy. Employees were moving faster, customers were being acknowledged rather than ignored, and even Rick was making an effort to oversee things properly. "I'll think about it," she finally said. Xavier nodded. "That's all I ask." As the evening wound down, Xavier knew his work here wasn't finished. He would be back, unannounced, to check in on things. But for now, he had done what he came here to do. He had pulled back the curtain and seen the truth. Before he left, he spotted the elderly man from earlier, still seated at his booth, finishing the last bite of his meal. Xavier approached, sliding into the seat across from him. "Good meal?" he asked. The old man looked up, surprised. "Best one I've had in a long time." Xavier smiled. "We'll make sure it stays that way." And with that, he stood, walking out of the diner with the certainty that things were finally on the right track. Xavier didn't stay away for long. 3 days after his initial visit, he walked back into the diner, this time without any disguise. The moment he stepped inside, he noticed a difference. The air wasn't as tense, the employees weren't lingering near the register, and the customers were actually being greeted as they walked in. It wasn't perfect, but it was an improvement. Rick was at the counter, flipping through a clipboard with an expression that suggested he was actually paying attention to something other than his phone. Grace was moving between tables, balancing a tray with practiced ease, and Dennis was shouting orders to the kitchen staff in a way that suggested urgency rather than frustration. Xavier stepped up to the counter, waiting to see how Rick would react. Rick glanced up, catching sight of him. His shoulders stiffened, but he nodded in acknowledgement. "Didn't think we'd be seeing you again this soon," Rick said. Xavier rested his hands on the counter. "Figured I'd stop by and see if you took anything I said seriously." Rick exhaled through his nose, setting the clipboard down. You were right about a lot of things. I let this place slip. Xavier studied him for a moment, and Rick tapped the clipboard, and I've been fixing it. Xavier took the clipboard from the counter, scanning the notes. Rick had made adjustments to the schedule, ensuring there was better coverage during peak hours. Food inventory had been tracked more carefully, and there were notes about implementing a rotating cleaning checklist. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was proof that Rick wasn't just waiting for things to go back to the way they were. Xavier set the clipboard down. This is a start. Rick crossed his arms. I'm not looking for a pat on the back. I know I've got more to prove. Xavier watched him for a moment longer before giving a small nod. Good. The door chimed as another customer walked in, and for the first time since Xavier arrived, he saw Megan actually step forward to greet them rather than wait for Grace to do it. Jared was wiping down tables without being asked. It was clear that the weight of Xavier's visit still lingered, but he needed to know if that weight would hold. He turned his attention to Grace, who was setting down a fresh plate in front of a customer near the window. The woman at the table smiled, saying something that made Grace laugh before she moved on to the next task. There was no hesitation in her movements, no signs of exhaustion the way there had been the first time he saw her. Xavier stepped over as she returned to the counter. "How's it been?" he asked. Grace wiped her hands on a towel before setting it down. "Better, people are actually working." Xavier leaned slightly against the counter. "And you thought about what we talked about?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. "I have." Xavier waited. She placed her hands on the counter, fingers tapping lightly. "I don't know if I want to be a manager, but I want to do more than just wait tables. I've been thinking about how this place could improve, and I have ideas." Xavier raised an eyebrow. "Ideas?" Grace nodded. "Better training for new hires so they don't get thrown in without knowing what they're doing. A system for tracking customer complaints so they don't just get ignored. And maybe a way to recognize employees who actually go above and beyond, so it's not just the ones who do the bare minimum getting by." Xavier considered her words. She wasn't just thinking about herself, she was thinking about the entire structure of the diner. "You'd make a good leader," he said. Grace exhaled. "Maybe, but right now I just want to make sure this place stays on the right track." Xavier nodded. "Then let's make that happen." He turned back toward the kitchen, watching as Dennis barked another order. The food coming out looked better than it had before, and the plates weren't sitting under the heat lamps for too long. There was still room for improvement, but progress was happening. Rick was flipping through the clipboard again when Xavier approached. "We're adding a recognition system," Xavier said. Rick looked up. "For what?" "For employees who actually put in the work," Xavier said. "Grace had the idea." Rick glanced toward Grace, then back at Xavier. "What does that look like?" Xavier leaned against the counter. "Bonuses. Shift preferences, maybe even a pathway to management for those who want it. People need to see that effort pays off." Rick nodded slowly. "That might actually work." Xavier straightened. "It will work, but only if you enforce it." Rick rubbed the back of his neck. "I'll make it happen." Xavier gave him a long look before nodding. "Then I'll hold you to that." As the evening rush picked up, Xavier stayed, watching as the changes continued to take hold. He saw Grace training a new hire, walking them through the register instead of just throwing them into the chaos. He watched Dennis reject a poorly plated dish, sending it back to be redone. Even Rick was stepping in, making sure orders were being handled efficiently. By the time Xavier finally stepped outside, the diner felt different than it had before. Not just cleaner or more organized, but something deeper. This wasn't just a restaurant turning things around. This was becoming a place worth working for again.